She sat in the corner of the conference room, clutching a cup of cold tea in both hands. She wore a gray cardigan that looked too big for her narrow shoulders, her hair pulled into a tight bun, as if she were trying to hide not just her face, but herself. The room buzzed around her, colleagues discussing the project, some cracking loud jokes, others talking over each other, and some deliberately ignoring her presence, even though she was just 3 meters from the whiteboard where the manager scribbled yet another brilliant strategy with a thick marker. Sometimes he glanced in her direction and immediately looked away as if she were furniture. Once, he even said, "Anastasia, that's your name, right? Please make some copies." He didn't wait for a reply, just handed her the paper like you'd send a file to a printer. She nodded, did as told. Never objected, rarely spoke, and always softly. "You're like a little mouse," a colleague with bright lipstick once told her in the elevator. "Girls like you stay in the shade their whole life." Another time, someone whispered in the hallway, "Who even is that?" And the reply came, "No one, just the intern." Except she'd already been working in the analytics department for 2 years. 2 years of being temporarily useful. 2 years of doing other people's work, signed with other people's names. But she didn't complain, didn't argue, didn't cry in the bathroom, though once after a meeting where her idea was credited to Ilya from marketing, she sat in a stall for 20 minutes, staring at the gray wall. Her voice was soft, nearly a whisper, but inside her was a volume no one heard, because no one listened. She never tried to stand out, didn't post photos on social media, didn't slam doors. She simply lived, worked, dreamed, at night, feared in the mornings, endured at lunch. And yet, on that very day, when the manager ignored her analytics warning for the third time, a warning that could have saved the project, she spoke just a little louder than usual. "I warned you 3 weeks ago." Silence hung in the air like an alarm bell. Heads turned, someone scoffed, someone smirked. The manager raised his eyebrows. "What did you say?" She looked straight at him, for the first time, without fear, without lowering her voice. "I said it before, you just didn't listen." Then she fell silent, and that silence was louder than anything that had filled the room before. For the first time in her life, her voice mattered, not because it was loud, but because behind it stood something greater: truth, data, certainty, and a life lived quietly defending her own worth. That evening, she went home and sat at her laptop. She started writing, not a complaint letter, not a resume for another company, a project, her project, the one that had been living inside her all this time, like a voice that was never allowed out. And in that moment, she realized speaking softly is not weakness. Weakness is staying silent when you know you have something true to say. And she did know. She had simply been waiting for her voice to stop being interrupted. But now she decided, even if they don't listen, she's going to speak anyway. In the office, she existed, but she didn't live. People walked past her, sometimes brushing her shoulder without apologizing. During meetings, they spoke through her, as if there were a blank sheet behind her where they could write their ideas, ignoring what she had already suggested. She brought coffee to the group discussion, even though it wasn't part of her job. No one said thank you, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't notice her. One day, someone left a box of archived documents on her desk, mistaking it for the storage area. She quietly removed it. Her office was called the Gray Cell: a desk, a chair, a monitor, a cup with no design. Her colleagues didn't know that in the evening, she returned home to a place with no TV, no guests, no calls. Just an old armchair, a cat she had rescued from the street, and a notebook in which she wrote down ideas every evening. Big ideas, important ones, ones that could change the structure, save budgets, simplify processes. But no one asked, and she didn't offer them, because she knew they wouldn't listen. Speaking when no one listens is like throwing words into a well. Silence is the only thing that echoes. One day in the break room, when she tried to say that she knew how to simplify the work with reports, someone nodded, not listening, and immediately changed the topic. You're not in the loop, Nastya. It's more complicated than you think. But complicated doesn't mean impossible. It just means they didn't know that at home, she had already been testing the automation she had developed herself for a month, without a programmer's degree, without help, just because she couldn't watch so much effort go to waste. In the department, they considered her convenient, quiet, submissive, non conflicting. People like her were needed but not valued. They were placed on the edge of the group photo. They were forgotten when emails were sent. They weren't invited to corporate events because they weren't interesting, because she's fine as it is, because they thought that if a person doesn't demand attention, they don't need respect. Then, one day, during a general meeting, when almost the entire department had gathered in the room, someone said aloud that the problem with analytics was the human factor. The boss waved his hand. If only we had a proper system. And then, for the first time, she interrupted him, not with a shout, not with a complaint, just with a calm, confident voice. We could have one. I've already written a prototype on a flash drive. If you want, I'll show you. The room froze. It was as if the lights on the ceiling stopped shining. The silence was deafening. The first to react was Ilya, the same one who once took her idea. He scoffed, "You, a prototype? You?" She calmly took out the flash drive and placed it on the table. "Check it. If it works, implement it. If not, I won't insist. But at least you'll know who's sitting in your team." That day, she saw real attention for the first time, not glances that passed over her, not from above, but focused ones. For the first time after the meeting, someone approached her, not asking her to print something, but with a question. "Did you really do this yourself?" She nodded, didn't smile, didn't brag, just answered honestly. And then a guy from IT sat down next to her and quietly said, "You know, I never really noticed you before." And she replied, "I've always been here, just no one listened. At first, one person, then another, then the room, and then the whole floor. Because in a world where everyone shouts, the loudest voice is the one that speaks only when there's something real to say. She was taught to be quieter all her life. As a child, when the TV blared in the house and her father would snap at her mother for every dinner not cooked just right, she learned to hide her voice, her words, and even her breath. Don't interrupt the adults. Be a good girl. Don't argue. These phrases grew into her like weeds in the cracks of old tiles. In school, it was the same. Those who shouted were called leaders, and those who simply did were called convenient. When Nastya answered at the board, teachers would say, "Louder, please, no one can hear you." And when she tried to speak louder, they laughed, saying her voice was like a mouse's. And she decided, no need. Silence is easier, calmer, safer. Silence became home, cozy, quiet, closed off from judgment, and then it became a prison. In university, she could have performed better than anyone else, but they chose the one who smiled wider and sounded more confident. At her first job, her ideas were rewritten under someone else's name. At her second job, they were ignored altogether. And all this time, Nastya told herself, it's not time yet. But then, after all these years, she suddenly felt maybe there was never another time except for now. After that meeting with the flash drive, something changed, not on the outside, but on the inside. Her step became a little firmer, her gaze a little straighter. She still spoke quietly, but her voice began to resonate in people's heads. Because now, behind her silence, there were actions. And because people started to fear the silence, especially if they hadn't noticed it before. Nastya didn't demand attention, she simply didn't back down, and that was scarier than any shout. In the hallway, they began to stop her. "Can you look at my report? What do you think? Could you suggest a solution?" And she gave suggestions, not because she wanted to seem needed, but because she knew. Once, no one helped her, but now she could be the person she once needed. At first, her boss pretended that everything was under control. Then he tried to invite her to a personal meeting to discuss potential, but she refused. She said, "I'd rather work than discuss." And she left, without drama, without scenes. She just chose herself again. This was the turning point he didn't expect. Everyone was used to quiet women being obedient. that if they didn't interrupt, they agreed, that if they didn't argue, they were incapable. But she simply didn't waste her energy on pointless conversations. She saved it for the real thing. And now that moment had arrived. Her new project was accepted, not immediately, reluctantly, cautiously, but it was accepted because it was accurate, useful, effective, and no one could claim it as their own. Too many already knew whose idea it was. For the first time at the general meeting, they asked her to speak, and she stood up, with an uncertain step but a straight back. She didn't shout. She didn't make a show. She simply spoke, the way she knew how, quietly, calmly, confidently. And in that silence, in that inner composure, in that honest delivery without masks, there was more power than in all the speakers who waved their hands and interrupted each other before her. And when she finished, no one applauded right away. A second, two, silence. But it wasn't deafening. It was filled. Her words sank into heads and hearts, and only then did the applause start. First one, then another, and then they all stood up. Everyone, those who didn't know her name, those who interrupted her, those who forgot she was there, and they all listened, standing, and she stood before them, still in the same shirt, without makeup, with her hair pulled back as usual, and for the first time, she felt it was worth the wait. Silence isn't weakness. It's a pause before the real word that changes everything. After her presentation, only 2 days had passed, but the atmosphere in the office had changed so suddenly that Nastya's ears felt blocked by the contrast. Those who had previously never noticed her now addressed her by name. One of the marketing managers suddenly suggested, "How about Nastya joins us for the strategic sessions?" Another from a neighboring department sent her an email. "Very inspiring presentation. Let's work together on our part of the analysis," and signed off with a smiley face as if they'd always been on a first-name basis. She read it all, but felt no joy, only wariness. It wasn't about recognition. It was about them finally seeing her as a tool, not a person. On the third day, they called her upstairs to the office where she had only ever been with printouts and reports. High walls, shelves filled with identical books no one ever opened, and a dark wooden desk behind which sat the deputy CEO, Pavel Arkadyevich. He was one of those who could speak softly, but in a way that made something tighten inside you. Nastya sat down opposite, controlled and neat, feeling how carefully he assessed her, as if scanning not her brain or experience, but her resilience. He started right away. "You've certainly surprised many, me included. Such initiative, such calm. It's rare, especially among women of your level." He smiled, easily, smoothly, like those who know how to win, not with directness, but with smoothness. "We've discussed it with my colleagues, and I want to offer you the role of coordinator for a new project group. This would be, let's say, a sort of promotion, of course unofficial for now. Formally, you'll stay in your position, your salary, as it is, but in case of success, we'll talk about the future." Nastya stayed silent. He continued, "What will be required of you is simple. Keep the team in line. We don't want unnecessary noise. Don't make a personal brand out of everything. People start to feel too free. You're not one of those, are you?" She still said nothing, but something warm and angry stirred inside her at the same time, because she realized they wanted to put her back in that same silence, just on another floor, sit her next to them but without a voice, give her the appearance of growth but not recognition, use her, and then forget her again when it's convenient. "No," she finally said. He raised his eyebrows. "Excuse me? No, I disagree." "Disagree? With what?" "With being silent. I've done that for too long. If I take on something new, it will be with a voice, with my name, with the right to speak openly, without formally staying in my position, without, we'll think about it later. I won't settle for half measures anymore." He pressed his lips together. For several seconds, he just looked at her. Then, almost unchanged, he said, "Are you sure this is your chance?" Nastya nodded. "I'm sure I've already had a chance. Once not to stay silent. I took it. Everything else is not a chance, but a deal. And I didn't come here to bargain with myself." He didn't insist. Just moved the folder aside and nodded. "As you wish." She left, calmly, but inside it felt like she had just walked barefoot over broken glass. Not because it was scary, but because it hurt to see how beautifully wrapped proposals turned out to be just another attempt to trap her in a cage. Only now, a gilded one. When she returned to her desk, her colleagues threw glances at her. Some expected her to agree, some to boast. But she just sat down, opened her laptop, and kept working. Now she knew silence is a choice, but refusing to stay silent is, too. And that was the hardest choice of her life. But for the first time, it was completely hers. The meeting started as usual. The head of marketing talked too long and too confidently, interrupting even those who weren't trying to speak. The CFO nodded mechanically, eyes fixed on his screen. Some checked emails, others flipped through the presentation, and a few simply existed, like furniture. Anastasia sat at the far end of the table, as always. She had long understood you don't have to sit in the center to be at the center. You just need to say the right thing, and they'll hear you, even from the corner. They were discussing a new project, complicated, risky, messy. Marketing insisted on aggressive promotion. Finance demanded cost cutting. No one asked for Anastasia's opinion. She already knew her voice was on the later if there's time list. But she listened carefully, compared, watched as one person said uniqueness about a generic product. Another spoke of savings, meaning salary cuts for the already overworked. Then Pavel Arkadyevich spoke, the very same one she once refused to negotiate herself with. He spoke with deliberate pauses like handing out awards. We need someone to keep the team focused, someone who doesn't get lost in emotion, someone who can hold the line, and then throwing a glance at Anastasia, without unnecessary outbursts, calm, constructive. The words hung in the air. Someone smiled. Someone pretended not to understand. But she did. It was a message, thinly veiled, poisoned, a public reminder that her place was where she wouldn't disturb important people. She looked at him, then at the others, and said calmly, "Restraint isn't silence, and being constructive doesn't mean ignoring the truth." The room froze. Her voice wasn't loud, but it swept through the air like a cold breeze in a stuffy room. Someone put down their phone. Someone straightened up. Pavel Arkadyevich pressed his lips together, slightly. He was used to quiet people never hitting back, especially not in public. Anastasia continued, "If we want a project that works, then let's call things what they are. Not unique when it's a copy, not savings when it's cuts, not management when it's control. Then we'll have more than a team. We'll have trust." Her voice trembled, just slightly, only at first, then it grew firm. She didn't stand, she didn't raise her tone, but everything she said rang louder than all the slides, stats, and strategies. After her words, a pause, not awkward, real, the kind where people don't rush to speak, but finally reflect on what they just heard. The first to respond was an analyst from another department. He said, "For once, I completely agree." Then a woman from HR, "Maybe we are too afraid to call things what they are." A few nodded. Some stayed silent. Pavel Arkadyevich said nothing. He just closed his folder and muttered, "Let's move on to the next item." But the real question had already been asked, and the answer was already in the room. After the meeting, no one followed Anastasia. No handshakes, no applause. But the looks were different. Not out of politeness, but out of recognition. Because for the first time, someone hadn't said, "Everything's fine." They said, "This is wrong," and stayed. Didn't run, didn't explain themselves, just spoke. And that was the word that turned the whole room, not because it was loud, but because it was true. She hadn't changed, at least not on the outside. She still arrived on time, still wore her gray cardigan, still avoided arguing over small things, and still drank her tea without sugar. But now, when she walked into the office, conversations would pause. Not abruptly, just for a second, but that was enough for her to feel. She was no longer being ignored. They were afraid of her, because uncomfortable women are not the ones who scream. They are the ones who suddenly start speaking when everyone is used to them being silent. When she was invited again to a meeting, usually about just numbers and budgets. One of the managers leaned to his colleague and whispered, thinking she wouldn't hear, "Here comes the one with a conscience again." She heard it, but didn't react. There was no need to defend herself anymore. She wasn't living for other people's approval now. Now they came to her with feedback, but not with gratitude, with veiled criticism disguised as concern. "Nastya, you're great, but you need to understand. Sometimes a too direct position can be perceived as a provocation. Not everyone is ready for such honesty. Please filter it. You have a strong approach, but be softer, okay? Be softer. Don't make waves. Don't say out loud what others only whisper in the break room. Go back to being easy to deal with, like before." But she couldn't do that anymore. She had already seen how many people were willing to listen. It's just that no one had given them the opportunity before. At some point, they invited her to participate in the preparation of internal regulations, unofficially, between us. "You're smart," they said. "You'll be able to structure everything we've discussed." But when she wrote the report clearly describing the systemic communication issues between departments and added recommendations that didn't support toxic leadership, they said, "We need to rephrase this. It's too sharp." She refused. "Then we can't use it in its current form," said the one who had patted her on the back just a month ago. "Then without my involvement," she replied calmly. From that moment on, she was no longer invited to informal meetings. Important emails were no longer forwarded to her. They stopped trusting her. But trust built on convenience isn't real. It's manipulation wrapped in a smile. She understood this and stopped playing their games. In the cafeteria, people started looking at her like she was an outsider, not an enemy, not a traitor, but someone who made things awkward. Because when you speak the truth, everyone who avoids it starts to feel uncomfortable, not because of you, but because of their own guilt. One evening, she stayed late in the office. No one was in the hall. She stood by the window, looking out at the city, the same city where she had spent so many years living in the shadows. And suddenly, behind her, she heard a voice, quiet but sincere. "Nastya, thank you." She turned around. It was the same girl from accounting, who used to always keep her head down and apologize even when she was interrupted. "I've watched how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you don't back down. I want to try too, to say what I don't like, to stop being silent." Nastya smiled. "Try. Your silence is not a duty, it's a choice. You can speak at any moment, and if it's scary, I'm here." This was the new her, the one they hadn't seen at first, the one they mocked, the one they belittled, the one they ignored. And now they respected her, they feared her, and secretly they looked up to her. An uncomfortable woman is not a problem. She's a reflection. She shows everything that others are too afraid to admit. And that's why it's easier to reject her than to acknowledge she's right. But she no longer needed recognition. She simply did her work, with truth in her voice, calm in her movements, and strength that didn't need shouting. This story started quietly, as always, as everything does in this company, where decisions are made behind closed doors over a cup of coffee, where smiles are the business cards, and the truly important words are never spoken out loud. That day, Nastya noticed that Alina from the logistics department, who always came in early, hadn't shown up. Not at 9, not at 10. By 11, an email appeared. "Alina no longer works with us. Please hand over all current tasks to the project manager." No reason, no explanation, no farewell, dry official, deleted. Nastya got up from her desk and went downstairs. Not to HR, not to the manager, but to the archive where there was always the smell of dust and tea in a thermos. There sat Lena, the cleaner, who knew everything about everyone but never told anyone. She looked up as soon as she saw Nastya. "Alina?" Nastya asked. Lena nodded. "They took her this morning. They said, 'She doesn't fit the team spirit.' And she just stayed quiet. Didn't cry, only forgot her jacket." Nastya took the jacket in her hands, ordinary light with a torn sleeve, and inside she felt something rise, as if someone had been pushed out of the house without explanation. She went back to the office. In the hallway, she overheard someone say, Too gray, always with her papers. We have a different pace here. At the general meeting, towards the end, when everyone had started to gather, she stood up. Without warning, without reason, she just stood up and said, "Excuse me, before we break up, I want to ask one question. Where did Alina go?" The room froze. The head of the logistics department cleared his throat trying to brush it off as a joke. "I guess they just didn't work out together. It happens." "No," said Nastya. "It doesn't happen. She was doing more than some entire teams. She never complained. She never missed a deadline. She just was quieter than the others." A pause. Someone lowered their eyes. Someone sighed. "I can't stay silent," she continued, "because if we don't stand up for her today, no one will stand up for us tomorrow. If we normalize silence as a form of exclusion, then we'll all drown in it." Pavel Arkadyevich frowned. "Nastya, you're crossing a line." She looked at him calmly. "I crossed it the day I started speaking, and I won't go back." Someone in the room stood up. It was the guy from IT, then the girl from support, and one more person. The silence was filled with movement. They didn't shout. They didn't protest. They just stood up, and that was enough. In the evening, when Nastya was getting ready to leave, an email came from the CEO. "Thank you for your position. We'll reconsider the situation with Alina. Tomorrow morning, we'll have a separate meeting." She looked at the screen and didn't smile. She just nodded, because she knew now she wasn't alone. Now, behind one voice, there were dozens. Now, if someone wanted to push her out, they'd have to look not into one set of eyes, but many. And at night, when she was already home, she took out that same notebook in which she used to write ideas when no one was listening. On the first free page, she wrote, "When you stand alone, it's scary. When you stand for someone, it's important. When you stand for everyone, strength comes." She wasn't a hero. She didn't want to be one. She just knew the value of a voice and the value of silence. And that evening, she chose again to speak. 2 weeks had passed since Nastya raised her voice for Alina. During this time, the internal climate in the company seemed to shift. What had previously been silence now came up in meetings. Those who had been quiet began to raise their hands. Those who were used to sitting quietly by the walls now wrote proposals, came up with ideas, asked, "What if?" and didn't receive cold stares in return. Something in the air had changed. It was unnamed, but it felt like the air had become clearer, lighter. Nastya still didn't hold an official position. She didn't have a nameplate on her door, but people started to come to her, not because of orders or assignments, just for her opinion, because what she said wouldn't pass through ears unnoticed. It would settle in, because she never spoke just to speak, only when she knew there was a need. At the meeting, when the leadership once again began to speak in abstract terms about development vectors, soft control, flexible influence tools, Nastya raised her hand without any special ceremony. But in the same moment, the voices fell silent as if it were a command. She simply asked, "Tell me, where is the person in these vectors?" Not as a resource, but as a being with a voice, with fatigue, with boundaries. And that was the moment when it became clear. They listened to her not because they had to, but because they no longer could do otherwise. Her voice wasn't loud, it was precise, sharp, honest. There was no threat in it, but there was a reminder. We're not here for numbers, we're here for meaning. One day, after the meeting, a colleague walked past Nastya and said, "You've become like a litmus test for us. If something feels uncomfortable, we ask ourselves, what would Nastya say?" She was taken aback, not from pride, but from depth, because for the first time she realized her silence hadn't been weakness, it had been survival, and now her voice wasn't a weapon, it was a guide. In one of the offices where closed discussions used to take place with behind-the-scenes decisions, now there was a quote on the wall. Nastya hadn't written it, but someone had printed it out and hung it up. "If you don't speak when you see a lie, you're participating in it." No one signed the phrase, but everyone knew where it came from. In the evening, walking down the empty hallway, she overheard a whispered discussion of a new initiative in the conference room. A girl from the HR department said, Wait, let's think before we roll this out to people. Nastya will definitely say something if something's wrong. And I don't want to feel like that little girl again, too ashamed to look people in the eyes. At first, Nastya wanted to leave, not interfere, not listen. But then she realized this wasn't about control, it was about influence, about how a word, once spoken at the right time, could spread its wings and touch people even when you weren't around. The next day, when she walked into the meeting room, everyone was already there, and someone had even left a seat for her at the center of the table. She walked past, sat by the wall, like before, but now it was different, because now the walls listened, because now she no longer tried to be in the center. She was simply herself, and that was enough to change what had remained the same for years. She used to sit in the corner waiting to be noticed. Then she raised her hand. Then she spoke when it was necessary, and now she simply acted. No announcements, no permissions, no, "Can I say something?" She no longer asked for the floor, because she understood. If you have something to say, you don't ask, you just act. Her voice became not an event, but a background, the kind that quietly enters the structure of the company, into conversations, into reports, into order, like fresh air, which no one notices at first, but then they suffocate without it. One day, a new employee came into the office, an intern, young, shy, with eyes full of timidity. She sat at the farthest desk as if trying to be invisible. During the meeting, she mumbled an idea, but was interrupted. No one heard her, but Nastya heard. And when, 20 minutes later, everyone was discussing something entirely different, she raised her head and calmly said, "Wait, let's go back to what Anna said. It's important." Anna flinched, her face flushed. Everyone turned to look. She suggested making the task tracking system more transparent for interns and new employees, so they don't feel lost. And that suggestion is much more valuable than we think. And it wasn't just returning to a phrase, it was a gesture, a statement, a message. I see, I hear. I'm here. After the meeting, Anna came up and quietly said, "I thought no one heard me. Thank you." Nastya smiled. "I used to think that too, but silence isn't a wall. It's just a background until someone's voice switches it on." Now, she wasn't just being listened to, she was being waited for, not like a messiah, but as a check on honesty. Before launching every project, someone would say, "Let's show it to Nastya. If she stays quiet, everything's fine. If she speaks, we should listen." She wasn't striving anywhere. She didn't climb the career ladder. But one day, the CEO called her in personally. No protocol, no agenda, just, "Come in, let's talk." He sat by the window. No tie, no formality. Nastya sat across from him. "You've become the center, without a title, without structure. They don't fear you, but they respect you. It's a rare combination." He spoke plainly, no pressure. "We want to officially offer you the role of curator of internal ethics and culture. This isn't just a department, it's the heart of the company. We've never had it. We want you to create it." She looked out the window. The rain passed by, gray, thin like a thread. "I don't fit the standard," she said. "I'm not the one who speaks loudly. I don't lead crowds. I don't like meetings with graphs. I'm not the format." He nodded. "That's exactly why. You're exactly what we need." She was silent, not from doubt, but from the understanding that this was the moment she had been waiting for. From the wall to the center. And now she could not just speak, she could build something real, something human, something pure. "I agree," she said, "but only on my terms. No displays, no games. Only with those who are ready to listen, even if it makes them uncomfortable." He stood up, reached out his hand. "That's the only condition we have for you, too." That evening, she went outside in her old sneakers, with a simple bag and the wind in her hair. People passed by. Some recognized her, some didn't. But inside her, there was no longer a need to be noticed, because she had already become the voice that resonated even where silence used to reign. The auditorium was full. No fanfare, no ribbons, no banners, no press walls. Just people, employees. Those who worked on the first floor and those on the last. Those who had never raised their eyes from the desk before, those who once laughed behind her back, those who had walked the path with her, and those who had just begun. Nastya stood by the stage. She hadn't been called. She had been asked to speak in front of the entire team at the internal forum, but she wasn't standing on the podium. She didn't hold a microphone. She simply walked out and stood in the center of the hall, on the same level as everyone, in sneakers, in a dark blue sweater, with the same voice that, over the years, hadn't gotten louder, but had become clearer. "I remember sitting in that corner," she said, nodding towards the wall. "I remember how I was afraid to lift my eyes. I remember thinking that everything I said didn't matter, and I stayed silent for years because I believed that silence was safer, that if you didn't stick out, you wouldn't get hurt, you wouldn't be laughed at, you wouldn't be fired. Then one day I realized, in that silence, I wasn't losing my job, my opinion, my opportunity. I was losing myself." She paused, not because she was confused, but because she knew now no one would interrupt. No phone would ring, no whisper would slip through. "I didn't start speaking so that I would be listened to. I started speaking because I couldn't stay silent anymore. And today I stand before you, not as a boss, not as a star, not as an example, but as a person who once was nobody, just nobody, in the eyes of others. But inside, I had a voice all along. It was just waiting for me to believe I had the right to use it." The silence in the hall wasn't tense. It was respectful, the kind where people aren't afraid to stay quiet because every word becomes more valuable. If you ever think you're not worth attention, remember that I, an ordinary girl, unsure, quiet, with no ambitions, no connections, no loud resume, simply started speaking. And that changed everything. People listen not because you scream, but because you speak with truth, with warmth, with intention. Nastya looked around. Some had already stood up. Then more. No one called for it. No one asked. They just started standing, not as at a premiere, not as at a show, but as a sign of respect. Those who had once ignored her, those who looked down on her, and those who, perhaps, would continue to live differently. But at this moment, everyone stood. Nastya looked at them and didn't feel great. She felt honest, finally, not loud, not convenient, just real. She said quietly, as always, "Thank you for listening. Now I know, sometimes to be heard, you don't need to shout. You just need to decide to speak." She left the hall without fanfare. People continued to stand. Some looked at the floor, some looked after her. Some held their notebooks in their hands, where, like she once did, they wrote ideas while no one was watching. Now her name didn't evoke fear, it evoked respect. Not because she became someone else, but because she stayed herself and gave others permission to do the same. And if before, when she spoke, everything drowned in noise, now everyone listens, standing.